We hope that you enjoyed the film at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art presentation of Mr. Soul. My name is Professor Neil Lester, and I am a faculty member here at Arizona State University, where I teach African American literature and culture. And I am delighted, beyond delighted, I'm ecstatic to be having this conversation tonight with those who are intimately connected with this fantastic documentary. So I'll introduce our participant panelists in no particular order, but I'll start with Nikki Giovanni, and you know that name, one of the original performers on Soul, is a university distinguished professor in the Department of English at Virginia Tech University. We know Nikki for years and years of activism for civil rights and equality. She's published just dozens of volumes of poetry and essays and edited anthologies, children's books, you name it, and she's done it. But relative to tonight, we have a particular interest in the fact that Ellis produced her collaboration with the New York Community Choir. And one other little tidbit that I learned in preparing for this is that Nikki hosted many of the episodes of Soul. So thank you, Nikki. And we're so glad that your conversation with Jimmy Baldwin is viral so that a new generation is hearing those gems of wisdom. We also have Blair Underwood, and we know Blair from television, from film, but he's the executive producer and the voice of Ellis Haizlip in this documentary. We know him as an American television, film, and stage actor, director, and producer, who has been nominated for the 2020 Critics' Choice Documentary Award for Best Narration for Mr. Soul. Congratulations. Been nominated for 11 times for NAACP Image Awards, and this is his 8th win. We know him for his voiceovers, for his narration, for his acting, for his presence on the screen. Thank you for these positive images and for reminding us that we are better than those headlines that tell us that we are not. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Neil.
And of course, there's Melissa Haizlip, who is the producer, director, and writer, award-winning, we might add, filmmaker based in New York. And at the heart of Melissa's work, as we see in this documentary, is the intersection of racial justice, social justice, and activism and representation. Particularly, her interest is in female transformation and empowerment, which grounds all of what she does. And of course, Mr. Soul has just been shortlisted for the Oscars for the Best Original Song and for the NAACP Award for Outstanding Writing on Document, and you name it, she's got it, and well deserved. So we're very happy to be part of this historical moment with you, Melissa. So thank you for the gift of this documentary. All right.
And thank you.
And for 12 years of persistence. I saw you in another conversation, so I want to bring that. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, who is a documentary subject, founder and author of Vision and Justice, which we will get to chat about tonight, about photography and history and justice. Professor Lewis is an associate professor at Harvard in the Department of History, the History of Art and Architecture, and the Department of African and African American Studies. Her research focuses on the intersections of African American and Black Atlantic visual representation, racial justice, and representational democracy in the United States, award-winning critical writing, research, photography, all of these things that are about justice and vision and African-American excellence. So we thank you three for gracing us with your presence tonight. And we'd love for this to be a conversation, as I said earlier, not a bad date. But I do have questions, but I'd love for the questions to be more free-flowing. And if you'd like to riff off of what somebody else, please feel free to do this. We want to recreate that joy that most, if not, well, I think all of us on this call experienced as we participated in and witnessed this documentary. So why don't I start with Nikki? How about that? Ellis, his recommendation that you record Truth is on Its Way in 1971, where you recite your poetry to a gospel track by the New York Community Choir. What does this collaborative creative expression say about the interconnectedness of Black culture across disciplines, communities, and professions, since Mr. Soul embodies that in so many ways?
You know, when Ellis started Soul, the first person he asked, he was shy. He's not like afraid, but he was a bit shy, and he thought he would not be a good host. So Alvin Poussaint, he asked Alvin Poussaint, but he was up in my apartment, and he said, "How do you think Alvin is doing?" Well, I like Alvin Poussaint. He's a brilliant young man, or he's not young anymore. He's a brilliant guy. And I said, Ellis, you know, this isn't working. Alvin is not working, and it's your show. So why don't you do it? He said, "Oh, nobody will like me." I said, "Ellis, you know, get over it. Everybody will like you. This is your show. You do it." Mm-hmm. And he took his advice. I did not work, and I must point that out. I want to point that out. Okay. I did not work for Ellis. I worked with Ellis. Okay. And it's very important who you work for and who you work with. Mm-hmm. And throughout the year, we discussed who would come on. I remember when he was asking, "Well, do you think Muhammad Ali would come and talk to me?" I said, Muhammad Ali talks to everybody, you know, and I knew Ali very well. Like I called him up and we'll have him. He said, "Well, we would really like to have Minister Farrakhan." I said, "Oh, Lewis will love to." And he said, "Well, you know, I'm gay. And he might be upset." I said, "I don't think, well, one, he's not trying to go to bed with you. And two, you're on television. He will be there. Do not worry." And I think that what I did for Ellis was to remind him that this is a great show. Mm-hmm. And I'm always reminding people, and I hope this stays in, that one of the important people in that show, creating that show, was Novella Nelson. And Novella said, you know, we have to have someone to do makeup. We have to have someone to do hair. We have to have someone to dress properly. That we're not just going to let Black people come on the show and shake their behinds. We're going to do it like any other proper show. And because Ellis had a background, as you know, in theater, mm-hmm. he took that mm-hmm. as good advice. We had good food on the show, and we had everything else that you needed, so that we were not just professional, but loving. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the things that everybody, you knew where everybody was on Sunday looking at television. You know, if they were Black, you knew where they were, because Ellis was bringing them a lot of love. And I think that's important. And I think Melissa would agree with me that what he brought was not just a professionalism, but a love to say to Black people, here we are, and this is what we can do. He brought a great show. And I'm not against Tony Brown, and truly I'm not. Tony Brown's Journal was wonderful, and there were a couple of other shows that came on. But Ellis brought us what I guess we would now call MSNBC, one of those shows, Rachel Maddow or The Last Word. You know, so he brought a show that was professional, that showed what we were thinking. And he didn't apologize. He didn't say, "Oh, I'm a Negro and I'm really good." He just did it, and you took it or you didn't. And I was very pleased with being a part of the show, and I was very pleased with what somebody like me. I'm a kind of a mean, but not always, because you know I fell in love with you, Neil. But kind of a mean,
it's mutual. It's mutual.
Absolutely. Yes. And yes. When we had Toni Morrison. And I don't know if this will ever stay in the show, but when Slade died, I wanted to do something for Toni because she was a good friend. And we decided to have all of the writers that we knew. We just wrote all of the writers and said, let's come to Virginia Tech and read our favorite Toni Morrison, and it will lift Toni up. And nothing's going to take the place of your dead son. He died of, as you know, cancer. But I said, you know, come. And then I called you and I said, Neil, you have to come. You know, you can't say no. Whatever we have to do, bring. And of course, I sat you next to Toni because she had a weakness for good-looking men, and I knew that she would be. She did. I knew she would be so happy if I sat you next to her.
Well, I know I was. I don't know how happy she was, but there was such joy in that also. Such joy.
Who was that?
Thank you. You know what I like what you just said about Ellis though is that it was interesting that he was courageous, bold. vulnerable enough to invite somebody on whose position he knew differed from his lived experience. There's so many who would actually steer away from that and only bring in people who have a certain perspective within a bubble. So that speaks volumes, where, as I said, you said he wasn't shy, he just didn't want to be in the spotlight. But that sort of elevated in many eyes who he was as a person, without having a megaphone saying, this is who I am, look at me, look how courageous, and I'm not going to challenge him. No, let him speak. And I'll go to Dr. Sarah Lewis. I know that you've done some work on this sort of intersection of genres as well, particularly in this ongoing excellent work, Vision and Justice. So perhaps you can share a little bit about the importance of visual representation as a change agent for these narratives of Black life, and particularly these narratives of Black life that bring forth humanity. Was that something you would be interested in talking with us about?
Sure, absolutely. No, it's a great question. If there's any reason, I think, that Melissa Hayslip gave me the honor of inviting me to be part of the documentary, it's because she saw a resonance between the Vision and Justice Project and the legacy of Ellis Hayslip. That's such an honor to the work that I do, but I think that the fundamental question that unites the projects is really this: what is the role of culture for justice in an American democracy? There are a number of ways to answer it. I think I would segment it out this way. I think first, it creates an arena, kind of an experimental laboratory for rehearsals of what freedom can look like in an expanded concept. I think secondly, it democratizes representation. It gives a new avenue towards agency when rights are denied. What the Vision and Justice Project does is it considers the foundational role that this question has played in American democracy by saluting the work of Frederick Douglass, for example. Mm-hmm. Frederick Douglass is one of the many thinkers about this topic, but he gave a speech when no one expected him to be thinking about culture and progress in Boston's Tremont Temple during the Civil War. And it stunned his audience, expecting to hear about anything else, but he spoke about pictures. Mm-hmm. Pictures and Progress was the title of the speech, and he stayed with this topic despite the silence of the audience, and making the case that American democracy would require culture to achieve a new vision of itself. And he says at the end of his speech, it might take over 150 years for American society to understand what I mean. And I would like to believe, and I know it's true, that he had a Nikki Giovanni in mind, right? A Blair Underwood in mind, a Melissa Hayslip in mind, a Neil Lester in mind when he said those words, but he never in his speech articulated or saluted the work of one photographer at the time. He was thinking about the work that culture affects in us, the critical imagination that it inspires in us. And that ultimately is really the perceptive altering work of justice to get us to see possibility anew. So the Vision and Justice Project looks at it in that historic context, but salutes the contemporary work that's come forward from it, whether it's that of an Ava DuVernay or a Carrie Mae Weems or Hank Wilson Thomas or so forth. And in a radial way brings them together very much as Soul did to offer inspiration.
And what's liberatory in that process of just doing that? Because that's a liberatory act in and of itself, bringing these people together and saying, here's who we are, here's what we do, and here are the possibilities of what justice can look like. Yeah. What's liberatory in that?
Part of it is that it creates a counter narrative in a time of injustice. Right? Much of the work of culture is precisely about that. It's about changing narratives that have been weaponized to denigrate human life or to justify the denigration of human life. And I think that the liberatory possibilities are then ultimately enacted in law, ultimately lead to activist change, but chart a new way forward.
It's interesting also, and it intersects with my work on justice. I'm just finishing a volume, or just did an edited collection that Nikki contributed to. And it really is, I think after George Floyd's murder, we can now say murder and not death, that it gave me pause to sort of figure out exactly what justice is. And I borrow from Ntozake Shange in an essay where she says, we still have to continue to imagine. And that's not an easy process for folks, because sometimes we can't imagine beyond what has happened to us. Right. And I think that's where the joy comes in, is that we can imagine that these things can coexist. So what we do know is what justice is not. What justice is takes on many possibilities and really takes an audacity to sort of imagine that.
It does.
Alyssa, did you want to respond to that, since I know this was your project and I know it has justice at the heart of it?
Absolutely. And I think, Ellis Haizlip's work was liberatorial and was, the idea of Black liberation was the modus operandi of all of his work. It was the very reason that he wanted to give agency to Black people, to create a show that was for us, by us, unapologetically Black, universal in that way, welcoming and inclusive in that way, not just to Black people, but to all people, to invite them to the welcome table in the Baldwin sense. Mm-hmm. And that what Soul was doing, as I'm so excited to have Professor Sarah with us tonight, especially, and to have her in the documentary, because I see her work as a furtherance of these great efforts, and of working and curating the culture and using these images of positive Blackness and positivity. And Ellis Haizlip knew that. He knew the importance of reaffirming our greatness, and the film Mr. Soul is really a love letter to Black culture, but also Soul was a love letter to Black culture in the same way. And we wanted that same provenance to resonate, 50 years later, this idea that, Black joy is an act of resistance, but it's also an act of resilience. And it's something that has always been ours, and it is an inalienable right. It's just that we have been so reactionary as a culture, of course, to our oppression and all that came before us from 1619 onward. But this idea of taking back reclaiming our joy and our Blackness, and so I'm so happy that this film is in this series, because it's so significant, the intersectionality around the work that's curated here, and especially the Obama portraits.
Yes.
So it's kind of historic to see this film in this context. And also, of course, Sarah has worked with the Obama administration, so I'll let her chime in about that. But, she speaks so eloquently about the work as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that notion of the love letter, because it's interesting that one has to somehow find self-love even when the world doesn't love you back in the way that you want and desire that love. Mm-hmm. And the USA has not always been very loving toward people who look like us. And how do you persist and remain resilient and find joy in the face of all of that? And that is exactly, it's the same sort of thing that Dr. MLK talks about when he talks about radical self-Black love, to love yourself despite all these things that are happening around you. And then to bring community in that is the ultimate experience of joy. All right.
Yeah. What's so crazy is when the New York Times wrote about the film, and we don't often read our own reviews, but the two words that stood out to me were radical joy.
Yes.
And I thought, yes.
but it is radical. And initially, you're thinking, well, what's so radical about that? But it's revolutionary, though. It's revolutionary when one, in the face of these things that are opposed and are bombarding, can still find some reason to get up. I think about the joy of the blues, or the joy of spirituals, or the joy of seeing you on the screen, Blair Underwood. Like, what exactly is there about this joy and this representation that you see across media platforms that Mr. Soul embodies, this sort of joy of full representation across media platforms?
What is it about that I see?
What is about that brings you joy, or that you witness as the manifestation of joy?
Well, Professor Lewis, Sarah, she said, just call me Sarah, but she speaks of Frederick Douglass, and that speech about pictures and the power of that, and the power of the image. We know that imagery is powerful, and it's beyond intellect. It's beyond conversation. It's beyond articulating a thought. It's a word. It creates something inside of us. It resonates inside of us. The profession I chose was to create images and to tell stories, but it goes deeper than that, because it's about our soul. The reason they speak of soul music and soul people, soul, the show, because we go deeper than mind and presentation. It's much deeper than that. So our joy, yes, it's resistance, it's resilience, but it's where we are as a people, and to capture that, as Melissa did and as Ellis Haizlip did, and for all the representatives at the time, like Miss Nikki Giovanni and everybody who was on that show. I wish I was around at the time so I could have been on the show myself, but it was revolutionary. And Melissa and I, we've talked about why do we not have a show like this now? I mean, now in 2021, with so many platforms, streaming and otherwise, we don't have a show quite like this.
Right.
But our joy cannot be denied. It cannot be ignored, and it will continue to persist as we continue to persist. And I do want to say also, you mentioned that, Melissa, you mentioned this is a love letter to Black culture, the show itself and the documentary. But I often say, too, that this documentary is a love letter from Melissa to her uncle, Ellis Haizlip. And it's important to say that it took an individual. It's all a collective. Anything we do in life, especially in this entertainment industry, it's a collective. But it usually takes one person to really break through and be bold enough and brave enough and courageous enough to, in this case, put those images in the forefront. Even though I love it, as Nikki was telling us, it was almost accidental. He wasn't supposed to be the host initially, but he was pulling strings and working behind the scenes. And those people need to be highlighted and honored. And that's what Melissa has done in this piece as well.
I wonder if Nikki, since you were in the heart of this creation, did you see at the time that it was revolutionary, or is this something that you recognize as you look back and over what it was and is? Did you see it at the time when you were in the moment saying, this is really something special now that's happening?
Yeah, I'm an intelligent human being, so I recognize that this is actually very important. Okay. And I am a big fan of the spirituals. And of course, we all remember the old spiritual that says, as our children, I'm a woman and I have a son. And as our children were being snatched away from us and being sold, or whatever one does with whatever the master does with the slave's children. Mm-hmm. I remember that one expression: if anybody asks you who you are, tell them you are a child of God. Yeah. And they wanted us to remember. My great grandmother, Cornelia, wanted us to remember. My grandmother wanted me to remember. If anybody, Black, white, or anything else, ask you who you are. And that was something that I could again share with Ellis. Ellis is a Washingtonian, as we know. And Washington, of course, also gave us Duke Ellington, if nothing else. It gave us Duke Ellington, and so it did. And so we're having that music. We're having that, for lack of a better word, that soul. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure at some point that his mother or his grandmother said, "If anybody asks you who you are," mm-hmm. because he's not going to say I'm a musician or I teach me. He's not going to say any of that. He's going to say, "I'm a child of God." And Ellis used to tell, of course, that wonderful story about, tell him, you remember he said that about his aunt when he had to go to Harlem. And he says, he was getting ready to go. They were at a party and he needed to be up in Harlem to a car. And he said, oh, my goodness, I'm going to be late. How do I get to Harlem? And she said to him, and he always said that, take the A train. And we ended up with the A train. But we ended up with, if anybody asks you. Mm-hmm. And I think that when we talk about how we found that joy, mm-hmm. we found that joy because we knew whatever else it was, mm-hmm. we are a child of God. And that's what's going to be and what continues to be important. I wish we had a show like that. I mm-hmm. wish we had a show like Rachel, and I look at it all the time, like Rachel Maddow or like Anderson Cooper. I wish we had a show that we allowed people of color to sit and talk, as Ellis did, to come in and sing their songs. I love Black Ivory, and they were 17 years old. I just love what they did.
Well, the sheer grouping of folks, though, and the dancers and the last poets and just everybody was there. I wonder if we could. Yeah, we talk about imagination. Certainly we could do that again. And certainly the time warrants that. And we talked about at the end, or the documentary, it talks about seeds being planted. So where do you see those manifestations of those seeds that may not be in the same way, but in ways that are similar, including your work, Sarah? where do you see that in terms of film, in terms of television? Do you see manifestation and say, we saw that seed and this is the growth of that particular seedling? Okay.
Well, I mean, there's a longer answer to this great question. I think the short answer for the context we have and time we have here is just to say it goes back to the point I think Blair made. There are individuals who we look to for this work. And when I put Vision and Justice together, I knew Frederick Douglass needed to be the framework, and I knew Ava DuVernay needed to be part of it. And she's one of the many individuals who we consider as a leader and a visionary in this regard.
And there are ways in which also, I mean, because sometimes these conversations can shift to exceptionalism, and we sort of pick out just those stars in the galaxy. And I don't mean like stars literally, but I mean, I'm looking at this in terms of W.E. Du Bois and Souls of Black Folks, where we're talking about these things coming together, that despite the fact that you may be that we may be teachers, there's still ways in which we are still in the Jim Crow car at the end of that chapter. So I do wonder, when we're talking about the souls of Black folks, how do we sort of measure, define, represent progress in the face of ongoing systemic racism? And that can be for any of you. But you wanted to add before, Sarah, before we move to that one?
Well, it's just to say I don't typically, I mean, as a scholar and a curator, and I loved saluting just one individual. So there's one other piece of that I just wanted to add. And it's this, when Ava was speaking about the idea of vision and justice in the interview with Bradford Young, who's an extraordinary cinematographer, she spoke about, in a way that very much was in lineage with Frederick Douglass, the internal DNA that pictures create in all of us. Ultimately, I mean, again, this is back to what Blair said, but these images that we ingest become our very soul. They define how we envision the future and progress. And so we all, whether or not we ourselves are makers, are living in this world of culture in ways that I think are more integral to how it is we go about the world than we fully understand and really salute and give credit for. So it's not just to herald the significance of one individual or the other, but to consider how important this is for all of our lives.
Well, and I must say that I love that picture that I've used also of the little boy in the Oval Office patting Obama's head. That is, if you talk about a picture, that cliche, a picture's worth 1,000, that was so validating that you didn't need an essay to explain it, because those who knew, when you're on the outside, you know exactly what that means, because we've had those moments where people are patting our hair and heads and deciding, oh, it's not like a Brillo pad after all, is it? It's like, no. And when I put my do-rag on, it doesn't mean I'm trying to rob you. It means that I want my hair to be pressed down when I get up in the morning. That's that inside joy and culture that comes from the braiding and the sitting down and, cornrowing the hair. And maybe to some extent, although I didn't realize this, those kitchen straightening parties where some people still have the scars around the neck. But there's a moment in which, Bell Hooks and others talk about that. Well, that was joy. And I remember your poem, Nikki Rosa, that's really about joy. We didn't realize we were poor because we had so much. And then I'll say one of the things, I feel like Shirley Caesar is back in the back of my head saying, this joy that I have, the world it is not going to take it away. The world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. And that's what it feels like when we see this excellence, this innovation. And it's not about toxic positivity, like we're only looking at this. It really is about the souls of Black folks that are way more complicated than all that other stuff. So talking about
let me break in for just 1 minute, Neil, if I may. There's a wonderful, wonderful young writer. Her name is Renee Watson. Mm-hmm. She's I hope she's great. And she was asked, she came to my class to visit with me, and somebody asked her, is that your hair? Because she wears, is that your hair? And she just looked at my suit and she said, damn right, I bought it and I paid for it. I've always loved that. Yeah, it's my hair.
It's my hair. Right. Well, my guess is all of us at one point have had one of those may I touch your hair moments.
Oh, yeah.
And can remember those like they happened yesterday. So let's talk about this. How do we measure, how do we define progress in the face of systemic racism and global white supremacy, as we're now naming it in ways that we haven't named it before? So, the absence of a soul series now, how do we represent progress? And I'll just throw that out and let anybody sort of pick up on that.
Well, one of the things that's important to recognize, and what Soul did, I think, and what the film is doing is conveying that there has always been Black excellence. You know, we think of this moment we're in as like the hashtag Black excellence moment, but Ellis already knew that we were excellent, and that it was just important to create visibility for that very thing. And sometimes that is still the issue even now, or I should say the challenge, finding, creating an opportunity or demanding space for the opportunity to be great and to be excellent, and to find those pockets of visibility. And, visibility politics is something we've talked about a lot. And when you look at Soul and realize that some of these artists, most of whom are being seen for the first time, the idea of being visible, even if they're musicians, which you normally hear, or if you're lucky to see them on the Chitlin circuit or maybe at the Apollo, but you don't get to see them. And the importance of visibility of Black folks and all the changes that are happening throughout our culture, it's still really relevant today.
Right. Well, I go back to the comment that Sonia Sanchez makes in the documentary about sexism. And she says something like, given the social and political landscape, this was really about a place and a time when the NAACP was sexist, the movement was sexist, the movement Dr. King led was sexist, everything was sexist. Makes no mistake about that. It was also homophobic. So there's a way in which what we do now has to be intersectional. And I know that you speak to that in terms of the presence of women in your work, and the way that you want to highlight, and the fact that Ellis also recognized that. It's very visible in there. You can't just talk about Blackness and only talk about Black men or Black cis men or Black heterosexual men. We have to talk about Black people.
And I think he was a feminist, and he was also an Afrofuturist. So he was thinking about the greatness of our culture to come, and envisioning greater moments for us all. And even though the culture was limited and women were not put forward, that was not, he saw beyond that. Right. And so the fact that he was able to elevate women and put them in the forefront, and have Ms. Nikki Giovanni hosting and helping backstage and performing and giving opportunities to Anna Maria Horsford to be produced for the first time, and really engaging around women's issues, and such that it wasn't unusual, that it was normal. And that sort of normalizing the importance of Black women in the forefront was something that hadn't been done. So we can look at it now and say it was revolutionary. But just as Ava DuVernay is, offering an entire 5 seasons of Black women directing her series, Queen Sugar, that should be normal. It shouldn't be unusual to have Black women. So we need folks to normalize that, and that's
not get so excited about the first. While the first are great, we shouldn't be sort of celebrating the first that this happened. So I want to go back to you, Blair, in terms of film and television. How are we measuring, or how do you see the progress, particularly in terms of maybe roles that you've seen, opportunities that you've seen evolve, or ones that have you've rejected because you didn't see yourself in those? Has there been any sort of evolution in that you've witnessed or are witnessing personally?
My God. Well, presence, a couple of things I want to say. How do you measure it?
Right.
I think you measure it in our presence, because, you can create space. And as Melissa was saying, and as Ellis Haizlip did, he highlighted Black excellence.
Right.
We created our own space when we were segregated. We had excellence, always Black excellence.
Yep.
Something to be said for what Melissa said, demanding space. And that means demanding space in other people's space. Right. Something our dear friend Ava always says, if there's not room for you at the table, create your own table. We can do that, but there is a mark, just to answer your question, how do you measure progress? Right. Part of it is demanding space in other people's space. I was telling somebody about Hollywood the other day. So listen, we got to be real. We didn't create Hollywood.
Right.
Hollywood was created by Eastern European men, the Foxes, the Samuels, and all people the families that are deeply generational in Hollywood. But they didn't create storytelling. Mm-hmm. In fact, we created storytelling. Mm-hmm. But the physical, actual space of Los Angeles, California, they created that. So that is their world. But we are now demanding space in that because we have value in that. So part of that is, how do we show up? Are we seen? To answer your question again, the other question you're saying about how do I see it in Hollywood?
Yes.
Listen, man, when I did LA Law in 1987, I think I didn't even realize this until recently. I had an interracial relationship. There was only the second interracial kiss on television. The first one was on Star Trek. I didn't even realize that at the time. It was entertainment newsworthy. All over the place. Black man kiss white woman. Now, literally, every third commercial on television, commercial. So we're dealing with commerce now. That means people are making money off this. So it's not only okay, people are leaning into it. Yep. So I'm not saying just because it's interracial, it's progress, but I'm saying the fact that people have let down certain barriers and we can see ourselves in all of our constellation of who we are, all aspects, all shades and colors. So that's one way, but there's just more of us, which is a beautiful thing to see, which means we have more and many different voices and perspectives.
I did hear somebody say recently something like representation is not just being seen, it's also being sold. And especially since George Floyd's murder, we've seen representation in lots of places. Is there a need to distinguish those, or can the benefit come from that? Sarah, representation is not just about being seen, but it's also being sold.
Neil, if you don't mind, I'm going to cut in because I'm going to have to leave.
Oh, okay.
But I want to just bring in one other thing. We were talking about the women. The March on Washington was an incredibly important march. And we have to remember that only one woman was on stage. So when we talk about the women, there was only one woman, and that was Mahalia Jackson. And King started his speech with, "We are here to cash a check." And he went on because King was intellectual. And when he finished his speech, the only star on that stage was Mahalia Jackson. And Miss Jackson recognized that the audience was not satisfied. And she pulled him. You can look at the speech. She pulled his jacket and she called him Doc. She pulled his jacket and he looked down and she said, Doc, tell them about the dreams.
You remember that story.
Yes. I mean, she's right. And had she not been there to do that, you need a Black female star to tell you what to do. So,
like that.
I'm so glad.
Duly noted. Duly noted. Yes.
I am going to have to.
Thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us tonight. Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, poet Nikki Giovanni, documentarian Melissa Hayslip, and actor Blair Underwood. Thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Special thanks to Film at LACMA for this virtual event. This screening and conversation are part of Film at LACMA's Black Joy and Resilience screening series, coinciding with the Obama Portraits Tour and Black American Portraits on display now at LACMA. For more information, visit lacma.org.
I love you. And Blair, of course, if I were a lot younger, we would have a different relationship.
I know that's right. I'm with you on that. Hey, Nick.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
You got to keep that in the show. Don't edit that part out.